My name is John Lobell. I teach architecture at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York. I blog at johnlobell.com or review movies from a mythological point of view at cinemadiscourse.com. You can reach me at johnlobell at mac.com. This is a lecture on Paleolithic and Neolithic architecture for first-year architectural history and theory, given at Pratt in fall 2013. So today we're going to talk about Paleolithic, Neolithic, and the Dogon, which is a lot, so my apologies. So we'll start with Paleolithic. And our dates are very approximate because the way I'm going to define Paleolithic, which is fundamentally the culture of hunter-gatherers, there are still some today, although very few. So when does it end? It's different everywhere. And there's some hunter-gatherer cultures to this day. Now, what does paleo mean? Anybody? It means old. And lithic means, Stonehenge is megalithic. What does that mean? Big rocks, big stones. So, old Stone Age. And I'm not going to dwell on this at all, except to say that modern human beings, which emerged roughly 100,000 years ago, are the result of a long period of evolution and going back, obviously, to the beginning in some ways, but even 4 million years in some senses. We have the emergence of our sort of immediate ancestors. And there are numerous hominids, and they all bred in, or evolved in Africa, and then they moved out of Africa. And so you'll find hominid ancestors, and they may not be ancestors, they may be off on one of the branches, they may not be our ancestors, all over the world, in all of the old world, not in the Americas. And the second to last of them was the Neanderthals, starting about 400,000 years ago and lasting till about 30,000 years ago. And then around 30,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, us, evolved in Africa. And then 70,000 years later, 30,000 years ago, they started moving out into Europe and then over to Asia and wiped out all the other hominids, including the Neanderthals. Now, exactly what was the relationship between Cro-Magnon or Homo sapien, which is us, and Neanderthal is continually under discussion, and we get more sophisticated about this. We're at the point now where we might be able to breed a Neanderthal. I think it would be totally unacceptable morally, but given what we can do with DNA, they now have Neanderthal DNA. So we can look at our similarities and differences. But we are not descendants of Neanderthal, but rather develop in parallel later. So our Paleolithic cultures are hunting-gathering. And so we use this term means of production. So we're going to go from hunting-gathering to agriculture to industrial as the major means of production. So we have the beginnings of symbolic thought. And I'm going to define humanness as, man is the tool-making animal, or walks upright, or has an opposable thumb. Well, our hominid ancestors were using tools and making fire 1 million years ago. This is not unique to Homo sapiens. What is unique, I'm going to claim, is symbolic thought, which we can see in the beginnings of art, astronomy, and notation. Motifs of bulls and other horned animals, interest in the lunar cycle, and we're going to see the spiritual system as shamanism. And again, my apologies for going quickly, and anything you don't get, you can download. Actually, you can even maybe download these in advance, and then you can have them on your screen if you're working on your computer, and you can grab them and move them into your notes. But anyway, architecturally, to the extent we can use that word, because there isn't any architecture. So, no permanent settlements, use of natural material which dissolves back into the landscape. Undifferentiated building types, everything happened in the same shelter. Territorial boundaries defined by myths and rituals. They don't have the geometric concepts or property concepts that we have, which is why when the Europeans get to North America and they say, well, can we buy this land? There's two different modes of thought encountering here, so that it's not, what happens is not, both sides are not understanding the same thing. And nature and landscape as living and conscious, which we see in shamanism and animism, which is a form of belief in which there are qualities in rocks or trees or whatever. And to the extent I'm using the notion of hunter-gatherers, 10,000 BC or BCE, everybody was hunter-gatherer. Agriculture had not developed yet. There were roughly 10 million people in the world. Now this is already a 30-year-old slide saying that there are very few hunter-gatherers left. 30 years later, there's a lot less. It's to the point where the anthropologists know them by name. So if you watch documentaries about peoples in Indonesia, in the rainforest or whatever, you watch 3 documentaries, the same people will show up in 2 of them, because that's how many there are left. Now, here's our first example, Terra Amata House in Nice, France. And in terms of what I've said, what's strange about the information here? These are not us. These are not Homo sapiens. 300,000 BC, we don't evolve until 100,000 BC, and we don't get to France until 30,000 BC. So these are Neanderthals, and they're not our ancestors, but they're already paralleling some thick qualities we're going to see in human beings. And so here's a shelter, 2 poles, a bridge beam, a hearth, making fire using tools. And here's a concept that I want to address today, and that is some of the fundamental ideas in our culture to this day are being laid down during this period. So, this is, if you ask any child to draw a house, that's what you get, right? Except my Israeli students tell me that they have flat roofs in Israel. But other than that, through if you ask a child to draw a house. And this is a phrase from Louis Kahn, the house as any child would draw. This is a house by Robert Venturi. So here we have these qualities, these sort of the archetypal imagery here with us to this day. So, is this tenuous? Can we really make this connection? Maybe we'll do better as we go along, but I want to introduce that idea. These are recently discovered shells dated at 100,000 BCE, and they were holes drilled in them to make a necklace, so they're decorative. So these are now taken as the first evidence of symbolic thought. It's kind of arguable whether or not Neanderthals had symbolic thought. And you can make a case that they do, but it certainly takes off with Homo sapiens. We're living in a world which is dominated by animals. The animals are big. They're powerful. They're everywhere. Huge herds. And human beings are eventually get the technology to deal with animals, but they are very impressed by them. So we're going to see the impact of this. And we're not going to say a lot about this period. We just want to introduce some ideas because we've got a lot to cover. But one idea here is the great cave paintings. So the most important one is in Lascaux, France. There are others. The ones we know are scattered through southern France and northern Spain around the Pyrenees. We find similar graphics in other places, and it may be they were here first, or it may be that just the geological fact of these caves made this stuff possible, and they just didn't have them in other places. Now, I'm not going to go into this in any detail. Huge networks of underground caves at Lascaux. They were discovered in the these various caves discovered late 18, early 1900s. One just recently, there's a documentary by Herzog about it in 3D. I hate 3D, but I went to see that in 3D. Here we see these horned animals, beautiful presentations, just around the time modern art was starting. And so I said, oh my God, the principles of abstraction mastered by these modern artists 15,000 years ago. People already, had predicted that. These were so impressive that some people thought they were forgeries. Today we have radiocarbon dating and all that stuff, so they're totally established. And again, this is very abbreviated, but there's one image here of a bison pierced by a sword, disemboweled, and a figure here, and we'll come back and look at this. This is a shaman. And so we see here the spiritual discipline of shamanism already dating back at least 15,000 years and is still extant today. Now, there's an anthropologist at Columbia, just died a few years ago, Alexander Marshak. He's been studying these markings, which we find everywhere, and he thinks he can make a case that this is calendric, marking lunar cycles, etc. And so we have the beginnings of notation. This is going to eventually evolve into alphabets, but that'll be a long time. Now, found in these caves, little figurines, predominantly female. This is the most famous, Venus of Willendorf. Now, we put Venus in quotes because Venus is the Roman version of Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love. And so these look pretty fertile, so they're associated with eroticism. This is the one we're interested in, Venus of Lobell. So this is a bas-relief on the wall. We have this female figure. We notice the full hips and pendulous breasts, same thing here. And she's holding a horn and there are markings on it. Now, here's an interpretation. These markings are indicative of the phases of the moon. Her other hand is on her womb, indicating a consciousness of coordination between the cycle of the moon and the woman's menstrual cycle. So this is taken as evidence of the human interest in the relationship between human beings and the cycles of the cosmos. Okay, that's Paleolithic. And we've got two textbooks, so we'll look at a lot more, but we have a lot to cover. But just as a footnote, I'm taking the position that these people are defined by hunting gathering, and that there are similarities between them and contemporary hunter-gatherers. Now, this is a controversial position. It's one I'm taking. You can, many scholars disagree with it. And that doesn't mean all non-modern people. There's certain cultures that fit in with this. For example, Australian Aborigines, Pygmies in Africa. A colleague of mine was just off with the Bushmen in Africa hunting with bows and arrows. The Yamamana Indians, definitely, in the Amazon, Eskimos, others. So, Australian Aborigines, less and less, but to this day, some exist in this hunter-gathering culture. They mark their territory by a walkabout. They imprint into the landscape their mythology, which marks their landscape, also with their art, and then also by where they bury their dead, and then that sort of puts a patina into the land. Their structures are totally temporary and then dissolve back into the ground, and this is all of the possessions of a particular male Aborigine. So we see a totally different relationship to material goods than we have today. I've got 3 mini storages I'm paying rent on just for stuff, not to mention my apartment or my office. So they don't have that attitude. Now, a lot of Australian Aborigines today are modern people, participate in modern culture, have jobs, and then they'll do this on a weekend to keep up their tradition. So some remain hunter-gatherers, and some are modern people with keeping a relationship to their ancestral traditions. Yamamana Indians in Amazon rainforest build this huge shelter, and after a while they hunt out all the small animals, and then they'll move and build a shelter again. They're not purely hunter-gatherers because they do grow a form of banana, so they are involved in some agriculture. But they're a good source for understanding these tribal cultures. One of our late colleagues would take his sabbaticals with them. Throughout the world, those few remaining hunter-gatherer cultures are being done in as their land is gobbled up for modern purposes. Shamanism. So, shamanism is you might say, religion, the original religion. If you have a group of tribal people, this will be the spiritual technology they will adopt. And there's a 30,000-year tradition of this, finding evidence going all the way back. Shamans started to be studied in the late 1700s in Siberia. This is a Siberian shaman. And we now understand that many cultures have shamans, all the way down to the tip of South America, all the way across Europe, American Indians, of course. People, do sweat lodge things to this day with shamans in the American Southwest. Here's an Amazon Indian shaman treating a little boy. Now, we associate it first with the shamanic journey. The difference between a shaman and a priest is the representative of an institution and is ordained and gains their powers through the institution of their religion. A shaman's a freelancer, and their spiritual powers come from direct experience. As a child, they'll have a fever, and during that fever, a vision will come to them of their shamanic powers. And if they haven't been lucky to be sick, they go out and they spend a week of not eating or drinking any water, and then they get delirious, and then their visions come to them. And this gives them, this informs them of their powers. They use altered states, drugs, drumming, trance. They have animal helpers. They've experienced death and rebirth. And they are typically involved in sorcery and healing. So your specialty might be defending your tribe against other tribes through sorcery. Your specialty might be healing. And so if you're not familiar with the term shamanism, an unfair term, but it'll give you an immediate idea what we're talking about here, a medicine man. So that's what a shaman is. And finally, the shaman negotiates three worlds. So, an upper world, a middle world, which is our world, and a lower world. So let's see what's going on here. There are key concepts in shamanism, and we're not going to go into any detail. There's a whole, I'm going to do a whole course in this, but shaman experiences the world mountain. This comes down to high cultures, as the pyramids. The tree of life. Tree of life is a symbol to this day. Axis Mundi, the world's axis. The center of the colonnade in front of St. Peter's is the world axis for Catholicism. Navel of the world, similar idea. And the three worlds. So when we see a notion of layers of heavens and layers of hells, which we have in Christianity, detailed by Dante, we see that most of the religions of I think all of the religions of the high civilization have these layers of heavens and hells, and the precedent for that is shamanism. So, Paleolithic, our takeaway. Humans are defined by symbolic thought. We have nomadic hunter-gatherers. Technology is organic. There's a famous documentary film called Nanook of the North, and it was made, I think in the 40s, about an Eskimo hunter and his family, and they were truly Aboriginal. They wasn't yet carrying a rifle, although very shortly thereafter most Eskimos got rifles, and today they've got snowmobiles. But he had a dog sled, and he and his family would build an igloo, go out on the hunt, and you see everything he had was made by human hands. So, for example, they had leather boots. So you take a seal skin. Now, we would tan the seal skin. Use tannic acid, which we can get from tea. You can tan leather with tea if you're stuck out in the wilderness. That's chemistry. They didn't have that. Nanook's wife would chew on the leather to make it supple so that they could make boots. So everything they had was made with their hands. You think of a Stone Age axe, or the blade of which is made by chipping flint with another stone. This is done with your hands. There's no baking, heating, chemistry. There's baking of bread or of grain, of seed. There's no baking of clay. And shamanism is the dominant spiritual discipline and contains the roots of the high religions. Now, issues for us today. What does this mean for us today? So here's a little provocative thought. There's a very important book about the impact of electronic technology on our culture. And it's a really cool book. It's written in 1964 by Marshall McLuhan, and it totally explains Facebook and the computer, even though he wrote it 30 years before desktop computers and 40 years before Facebook. So in this book, McLuhan observes that with the electronic information age, we have again become hunter-gatherers, this time hunters and gatherers of information. What does that mean? Now, I'm going to suggest something for you to think about. That if you look at the core ideas in the consciousness of hunter-gatherers, we are moving toward those ideas. We're starting to think the way they do, as opposed to thinking in machine thought, which was the dominant technology of the industrial age that we've now moved out of into the information age. Well, think of it another way. They weren't thinking, what do we need to do to survive? They were thinking, this is what we do. Why do people, the moment they get home, log into their Facebook account? It's what people do. It becomes a mode of consciousness. So rather than existing in a mechanistic world in which this gear turns that gear, turns the next gear, turns the next gear, and McLuhan uses the term linear logical thought comes out of the machine age. Instead, we live in a world of interlocking networks. We think totally different. And you look at fundamental ideas in science, in entanglement, in quantum theory. It's not linear causality. It's totally interlockedness. In Darwin's theory of evolution, he proposes that natural selection is what drives evolution. A mechanistic notion of you've got 10 offspring, one of them is a little bit better at doing X, X is necessary, the other 9 eventually die off, and that slightly different 10th one, and you do this for millions of years, you get evolution. Problem is, evolution doesn't go that way. It goes in what's now called punctuated evolution. It goes in rapid jumps. How does it do that? Well, it turns out, in Lynn Margulis' theory of symbiogenesis, that evolution takes place due to massive genomes. You have all this DNA. And I think that my DNA is all inside my skin. I am an entity. Well, it turns out that the bacteria in my body is equal in weight to my brain. And that 90% of the DNA inside this skin is the bacterial DNA, not my DNA. And this bacteria is moving this DNA all over the place. Every time you sneeze, it's just this one big network. And Lynn Margulis says, you look at a pointillist painting by Seurat, Sunday in the Park with George. So there are all these very classical figures, very stiff, very classical. You go up close, and it's all dots. There's nothing there. It looks like I'm here. I'm actually a temporary gathering of DNA that's just floating all over the place in networks. So, a totally different way of thinking for people in the information age as opposed to the machine age. And once maybe these people have something to offer. Just the way when we get to really dicey stuff in quantum theory, maybe we should be looking at some ancient Indian mathematics. And not just that mathematics that we selected because it conformed with our 19th century mathematics. Maybe they were doing stuff that we couldn't even imagine, so we just left that out. So, oh, that's the alchemy part where they didn't know what they were doing. And let's go back and look at it again. Because we are no longer these people needing their mechanistic stuff. We're now these people needing their transcendent networking stuff. So that's the argument. It's just, how can we look at these other cultures and see them not as, well, they began some good things and eventually we got it all together. And they were trying but weren't there yet. But they had a totally different mode of thought that, Okay, Neolithic. Moving right through human history. New Stone Age. Neo is new. Lithic is stone. So if you make a lithograph, that's when we were doing printing from acid etching on stone. That's a lithograph. Very approximately, roughly 10,000 years ago, we have the first introductions of agriculture. And this is, again, there are lots of places it didn't happen until much later. And there are lots of people who are still today, a few people who are still today in the Neolithic period. Neolithic mode of existence. And so it's all over the planet, these dates differ a little bit. That's why I say very approximately. So, the defining thing is agriculture and small scale. Large-scale agriculture where there are tens of thousands of acres of wheat that we're going to see in Egypt. This goes with the high civilizations. But small-scale agriculture, might even say gardening. The moment you get agriculture, what big change is going to happen? You're no longer nomadic. You've got to be there when the crop comes in. So all of a sudden, we become slaves. You got to milk that cow at 6 o'clock every morning. You miss one day, it gets another infection, and you lose your cow. Every day, your entire life. So, we get permanent settled villages. The nomadic thing ends. We also get trade, which becomes a source of affluence. There's a cultural theorist, Matt Ridley, and he uses the term why, just around the time of Neolithic, is there this rapid takeoff in technological development, leading to, not to, but we're along the way, because it's still going on. And where you had tens of thousands of years of human beings, fully same brains that we have, making beautiful tools, but no change for thousands and thousands of years. And his term is sex between ideas. And that comes about with trade. And we got obsidian. Obsidian's a beautiful black, it's like coal, beautiful black stone that chips sort of like coal. And you can make razor sharp tools from it. You can make beautiful decorative jewelry from it. And the people who have obsidian are trading with the people who have ivory, or trading with the people who have skins. And so all of a sudden, technology prosperity happens, taking off. We get some core fundamental technologies, pottery, textile, metallurgy. Now, let's just pretend this is a coffee cup. So here's my ceramic coffee cup. Here's my metal laser pointer. Here's my cotton shirt. Every one of these technologies was developed by these people. And to this day, these are, we have synthetic fibers, but cotton is still the main deal. Megalithic structures, I'm not going to pause on this, is what we're going to be looking at. Egalitarian social structures. So we find in burials that it does not appear to be that there is a big deal hierarchy. And when you get a burial that we find, for example, in Mesopotamia, Donald and I went to Penn, in the museum there's this beautiful Mesopotamian harp. This is found in a grave where there was a couple, and then 500 young women in beautiful dress, all with their throats cut. They were the whole court that are buried with the leaders. We don't get that in this period. That's later. So there appears from the graves to be in relatively egalitarian social structures. And these cultures flourished for thousands of years with virtually no warfare. So, some interesting suggestions here. Architecture. Small farming villages and permanent dwellings, stone, mud, brick, and wood. Beginnings of differentiation of building types. Megalithic. Megalithic means Stonehenge. We're going to see others, but just so you know what we're talking about here. And earthworks. This is really cool. So here's from a children's book, image of a Neolithic village, and we see all the things we're talking about. So we have permanent settlement, mud brick stuccoed over with thatching for construction, pottery. Here's a kiln for baking the pottery. Here we are able to hewn wood to make beams, and this is based on agriculture. Here we are outside harvesting the wheat. So, permanent architecture, agriculture, and animal domestication. What's the first animal to be domesticated? Probably the dog. And then for food, the term is barnyard fowl, chickens. And it happens simultaneously in the Middle East and in Asia. And then pottery and textiles, and metallurgy. Start to get people working with copper and some hints of bronze. Now, all over the world, and we're going to show later, this is a global world culture. All over the world, we have these little towns. And when you get into this and you look and say, my God, they're like several patterns, and they just show up again and again, and they'll be thousands of miles apart. And so how come? For one thing, people were moving around, and we really don't yet have a notion of that. But it's going to be possible because through DNA you can tell, my father's side of the family is from Central Europe. And my sisters keep saying, let's get your DNA tested. I think that we're descendants of Genghis Khan. And probably most people are, so. But we can now do that through, and it's getting more and more sophisticated, what you can figure out from this DNA. Anyway, these towns are all over. We'll just look at one, Çatalhöyük in Turkey. Now we're going to look at Mohenjo-Daro when we get to India. But here, these are some of the others, including Bampo in China, and we've got nifty dwellings from them. But Çatalhöyük in Turkey, right here. And we have mud brick stuccoed over construction, timber roofs, and tightly bound together with no roads. You moved over the roofs and then you dropped down by ladder into the spaces. So this is started being excavated in the 20s, still moving along. And one of the interesting finds is these shrine rooms. So we have the emergence of a figure here that we call the Great Goddess. And this is a female deity, originally very controversial. We're going to see later a woman named Maria Gimbutas, who her first book was called Goddesses and Gods of Old Europe, looking at, long before there were gods, the Greek gods, there was a goddess. And she couldn't get the book published. No academic, and she's, PhD, heavy-duty scholar, the whole thing, refugee from Europe. And finally, she was allowed to publish a book, but she had to change the title to Gods and Goddesses of Old Europe. She could, and now recently, say recently, 30 years ago, the whole academic climate has changed, and she could retitle her book, Goddesses and Gods of Old Europe. Well, what do we have here? Well, first of all, this goddess is the universe. So it can be anthropomorphized here in this goddess figurine, goddess with her animals. It's the universe as a whole. This is before dualistic thinking of male, female. And now here we have this goddess figure with a bull's head giving birth to bulls. Over here are a pair of breasts. The nipples are hollow instead of positive, and there are vulture beaks inside each nipple. This figure gives birth and takes back in death. There's no, okay, there's the good goddess that gives birth, and there's the evil goddess, death. Death is not evil. Death is part of the cycle of the universe. And it's all embodied in this one, I shouldn't even say deity, but sort of overarching concept. Now, let's look at some other Neolithic dwellings, and right here. Now, it's an interesting background in anthropology. When you go to the big conferences, particularly 20, 30 years ago, but still today, the Europeans are kind of, first of all, they think they're superior because they're Europeans, but they're kind of snooty toward the Americans out of defensiveness, because for a European, say, French person in Paris, to get a grant to go spend a year with the Dogon, who we'll see later, is a big deal. They may not get that opportunity. The Americans are living in right here where there's Indians all over the place. And a lot of their culture is degraded and corrupted, but a lot is still available. And so the American anthropological material is very rich because there's recent culture right here. So let's start with some dwellings. And first we have Mesa Verde in Colorado. These are the cliff dwellings. It's just absolutely magnificent. I mean, there should be some human beings in here. But they're really small. I mean, imagine living in this. Just the power and beauty of nature. And look at how it blends in so we can have a sense of their organic interrelationship with their environment. Now, these cultures disappeared, or these are no longer occupied. People are still around. It was not due to the Europeans. So these were emptied out 100 years before Europeans even started getting to the Americas. This is Pueblo Bonito, and it's sort of a human-made cliff dwelling. So there's several of these. You're better off with an SUV. You spend an hour on a gravel road to get here. It's really rough stuff. It's built up in the back. This is north. So north is usually hostile. You don't have the sun, you get cold winds, and then it comes down to this open plaza. And of course, all this is in ruins, it's gone. So it's sort of like a human-made cliff dwelling. The square spaces are dwellings. The round ones are called kivas. They're little shrines. And they are for men only. And the world will come to an end if a woman goes in there, which is, they do. It's not, but that's their mythology. And this will be a clan kiva for the whole clan, and then these are smaller ones. And out here somewhere, there's a huge one for the whole area. And these kivas are used to this day, so we know in exact detail what every part is, how it's used, what the ceremonies are, because they go on to this day. And this American anthropologists have the opportunity of studying that because it's right here and still alive. This is Fajada Butte, discovered by a woman artist named Anna Safier. And what this is some stones on a ledge. These stones did not fall here by accident because strata wise, they come from lower down, so they were hauled up here. And they cast shadows against the wall and back. On that wall are spirals, and the patterns of not the shadow, but the light, which are in the form of a dagger, so it's called the sun dagger, mark the equinoxes and solstices. So it's a calendar. And here is the Taos Pueblo today. There are Pueblo Indians today. They're culture is still very much Neolithic in they do dry agriculture with corn, which means you have to carry the water from far away to water your corn. And they do pottery, which gets them a good living. The famous women potters. Now, we find this spiral in the pottery. When you go to the Metropolitan, when you go to the China-Japan section, stop at the very beginning, because the Metropolitan was very good about arranging in chronological order the earlier stuff. So they've got Neolithic stuff in the glass cases right where you come in, and you, oh my God, there are the spirals. Same spirals, China-Japan, that we have here in North America. Then go to the Egyptian collection, same thing. The first room is all these glass cases with the very early stuff in their chairs so you can sit down and examine them. And on this pottery, you'll find these spirals. They practice that to this day. There's a very famous potter, Maria Martinez, and black on black. Very difficult to develop this technologically. I was in a shop, and I picked the thing up, and the lady behind the counter says, you might want to be careful with that. That's a $40,000 pot. So she's very collectible. Now, earth mounds, and we're only going to do one slide here, but we use the term for the Midwest of mound cultures. There's all these cultures. They built these earth mounds. Why? What was this? Well, there seems to be artifacts in them. They're all over the place. Farmers just knock them down. They're just in the way. They tend to get preserved if there's a golf course, because they sort of make an interesting, nice feature. They're very well taken care of in Ohio, and there'll be nice museums at them, and there'll be displays where you go in. The most famous one is Great Serpent Mound. Now, read this white stuff out. This is a path, modern path that you walk on, but we have a curled up tail, and then a great snake here with an egg in its mouth. It's called the Great Serpent Mound. And it's one of these many, many mounds, the most spectacular. Now, just to jump ahead, in the Mississippian culture, down here, is actually pyramids. And at the base, the dimensions at the base, the largest pyramid there is larger than the Egyptian pyramids. So there's all kinds of interesting stuff going on, even in North American culture, if you get into this stuff. Okay, megalithic structures. So let's not pause on this slide, because here we go. First one is Stonehenge. Stonehenge is in England, Salisbury Plain, and we're going to notice several things here. First one is, look at the dates. It's built over a period of 1,300 years. So this is developed over, it isn't done once. This developed over a long period of time. It's called a stone circle. The henge is the ditch around here. So stone and henge. It's got astronomical alignments, and it was added to by different cultures over a long period of time. Some of the stones have fallen down. You have a series of these standing figures, menhirs and capstones. The stones in the center are later Iron Age. The ditch is first, then it's called the Ardbury holes, which are cylinders of white chalk dropped into the ground. These are believed to be lunar alignments, and then the main stones are solar alignments. So this is winter solstice sunrise over the heel stone. So it's calendric and useful in that sense that you keep track of, you're an agricultural culture, you got to know when to plant, but then also ceremonially putting us in accord with the important thing, and the important thing is the progress of the seasons. And there's no mystery about how Stonehenge was built. There are no space aliens involved, no space aliens in anything we're going to be looking at. You just need a lot of people and a lot of ropes, and you can build these things. And then they would build up with a lot of timber to get the capstones on top. And there are lots of them. They are all over southern England. They're all over northwestern France. And there are related things all over the world. We have the Great Medicine Wheel in Wyoming, in this country. And there's some that are far larger than Stonehenge in diameter. Stonehenge has by far the largest stones. This is Arbery, quite large, and there's a town in the middle of it in England. Okay, we're going to do 3 of these. Next one is Maltese temples. This is in Malta. So Malta and its companion island are off of Sicily, between Libya and Sicily, or in the middle of the Mediterranean. And megalithic construction, absidial plans, and statues of goddesses. So first of all, megalithic structures, big stones, an outer wall, an inner wall they would fill in between. It's unclear how and whether they were covered. They probably were. Here's the most archetypal plan. And then we argue this is in the figure of the great goddess, and in entering this temple, you're entering the body of the goddess. Now, how do we know that? Well, because it could just be a bumpy shape. Well, it turns out there are these sculptures there, so that pretty much pins it down. Some of the stone is dressed, well finished, and we notice here, this is the date of the first pyramid in Egypt. So these predate the pyramids. These European structures were previously dated later than the pyramids. The Europeans were too dumb to do this. So it must have been people coming from Egypt that showed them how to do it, because the Egyptians were much more advanced. And the Dean of European Archaeology, Colin Renfrew, about 35 years ago, recalibrated the carbon dating, and it turns out this stuff is earlier. Finally, Newgrange Passage Mound. So this is in Boyne Valley in Ireland, and again, predating Egyptian pyramids. Megalithic structure with earth mound. So, what do we have? We have an earth mound originally covered with white quartz. So it just absolutely gleamed in the sun. And then there was black obsidian in patterns in the white quartz. All that has fallen off. Rather than try to restore it and fake it, because I have no idea what it looked like, all the quartz has been piled up in front, but this is not original. We have an entrance. Above the entrance is what's called the light box. Sun comes in through the light box. The ground is sloping, keep water out. You go inside, there's a cruciform plan, shape of a cross with an apse. Slopes up, you come in, the sun can penetrate through the door, but then it just hits the ground. But through the light box, it goes always back and hits spirals on the back wall. On sunrise, winter solstice. Where did we just see that? North America, 1,000 years later, 5,000 miles away. So, this is a global culture, very interesting. Now, I want to jump ahead and introduce an idea here. Picking up on, let's look at these things and think what might be, where might there be seeds in this material for later cultures. So, beginning of next year, we'll look at Gothic cathedrals. So here's Chartres Cathedral, 1100 to 1200. We've got entrance, rose window, a nave. Here's the plan. Nave, transept, apse. There's more to it, but we're making a narrow point here. So, Chartres Cathedral, 4,000 years later, nave crossing apse. Here we are, Newgrange, nave crossing apse. Looking down the nave of Newgrange, the nave of Chartres. Here we are looking straight up into Chartres at the crossing. Here we are looking straight up into Newgrange at the crossing. Here is the light box above the entrance, sun at winter solstice. And here is the rose window above the entrance of Chartres. So, the idea I want to introduce is that this Neolithic material can lay down fundamental archetypal forms or archetypal concepts that can show up in later cultures. Now, when it's a coincidence and when there's something going on here, you can think about that. Now, one more thing. There's a structure very common in this period called a dolmen. It's a portal tomb and may have originally been covered with earth. I think of it as a mini Newgrange passage mound. So it's probably a burial chamber, vertical, horizontal stones. And here we are in Ireland, where we just saw Newgrange passage mound. Here we are in Spain. Jordan. India. China. Korea. So all over Eurasia, we see this. Now, these Neolithic cultures come to an end, and I want to suggest that, we've been sitting here with the Neolithic, and we can't wait to now get to the Mycenaeans and their mighty warrior culture, and then we'll get to be a high culture. That's a kind of a teleological point of view. We'll be discussing over the years what that means. But what if these people are quite happy where they are, doing what they're doing? Well, then how did things change? Specific historic event happened. So here's the scholar Marita Gambudis that I mentioned before, died 20 years ago. And her work shows that a group of people who are now called the Indo-Europeans, and they are identified by language. So in India, all the way through Europe, is the same language origin. So that Sanskrit has the same roots as Latin. Chinese is different, but Sanskrit shares the same roots. Why is that? And why is it that we look at a god like Zeus for the Greeks and find that Thor for the Scandinavians is the exact same figure, thunder-wielding chief of the gods, and that Indra in India is the exact same figure? And the answer is that these were the deities of these people. And they spread out from the steppes of Russia, and they had battle carts, and they were invincible warriors. They were nomadic, they were warriors, they had a chief sky god, and a Zeus, a priest god, Apollo, and a blacksmith god, Hephaestus. And so in every one of these cultures, you get these three gods. And the blacksmith god is, of course, important for building the chariots and the weapons. Conquered and wiped out and merged with these Neolithic cultures. So I'm not going to go through this. You can look at the slide. Here's the longer version. So our takeaway: Neolithic, beginnings of settlements and early agriculture, craft technologies, ceramics, metallurgy, textiles. Now metallurgy is using chemistry, putting together tin and copper to get bronze. You're baking the pottery, changing it, making it permanent. That did not exist with the Paleolithic. Goddess-centered principles that carry into high cultures and a worldwide culture. So as we go forward in this course, look for things that have their origins in this Paleolithic, Neolithic cultures. In a couple of weeks, we're going to look at something called the Treasury of Atreus. Very similar to what we see in Newgrange. So I'll give you something to think about.